The people who judge you the fastest are usually the ones who know the least about you. The voice came from somewhere in the crowd, but by then almost nobody was paying attention to who had said it. Every eye in the parking lot was focused on the same man. The afternoon sun reflected off hundreds of car windows outside the Maple Ridge Mall as shoppers slowed their pace and turned their heads toward the growing commotion near the main entrance. Some stopped beside shopping carts. Others pulled out their phones. Within seconds, a small crowd had formed. At the center of it all stood Elijah Carter. The 41-year-old black man wore a simple navy jacket, dark jeans, and clean brown shoes. In one hand, he carried a neatly wrapped gift box covered in bright silver paper. It looked completely out of place in the middle of the tension building around him. Elijah's expression remained calm. Not angry, not afraid, just calm. A calmness that seemed to bother certain people more with every passing second. A few feet away stood Officer Brandon Hayes. His uniform was perfectly pressed. His badge caught the afternoon light each time he shifted his shoulders. He had already made up his mind about the situation, and everyone around him could see it. "Stay right where you are," Brandon said firmly. Several nearby shoppers exchanged nervous glances. Elijah stopped walking immediately. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once. That should have made things easier. Somehow it did not. A teenage boy standing near a fountain began live streaming. Within moments, more phones appeared. People whispered to one another, trying to figure out what was happening. Some assumed Elijah had done something wrong. Others were not so sure. The strange part was Elijah himself. Most people placed in the center of unwanted attention looked uncomfortable. Elijah did not. He glanced briefly at the gift box in his hand, then looked at his watch. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Brandon noticed it immediately. "You think this is funny?" the officer asked. Elijah looked up. "No, sir." His voice was respectful, measured. "Then why are you smiling?" Brandon asked. Only then did several people realize Elijah had the faintest smile on his face. Not arrogance, not mockery, just the expression of someone waiting for something. Elijah lowered his eyes toward the watch again. "I was just checking the time." The answer seemed simple enough, yet it somehow made Brandon even more frustrated. Around them, the crowd continued growing. A mother holding shopping bags paused near the entrance. An elderly couple stopped beside a flower display. Mall security stood nearby, unsure whether they should intervene or simply observe. Elijah remained exactly where he was. The gift box never left his hand. The silver wrapping paper shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight. Then he checked his watch one more time. This time, a slightly larger smile appeared. Brandon noticed it. So did everyone else. And somewhere far beyond the edge of the parking lot, unseen by the crowd, a line of dark vehicles had just turned onto the road leading directly toward the mall. Officer Brandon Hayes could not understand what bothered him more, the crowd gathering around the scene or the fact that Elijah Carter seemed completely unaffected by it. Most people became nervous when dozens of strangers stared at them. Most people tried to explain themselves. Most people demanded answers. Elijah did none of those things. He simply stood beside a concrete planter near the mall entrance, holding the silver gift box with one hand while occasionally glancing at his watch. The behavior made no sense. A warm breeze drifted through the parking lot carrying the smell of fresh pretzels from a nearby food stand. Children laughed somewhere near the fountain. Shopping bags rustled. Yet the atmosphere around Elijah felt completely separate from everything else, as though he were standing inside a different story than everyone around him. Brandon folded his arms. "You seem awfully relaxed for someone in this situation." Elijah looked up. "Should I be nervous?" The question drew a few quiet reactions from people standing nearby. Brandon frowned. "That depends." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough." The answer was calm enough to make several people exchange confused looks. A young woman standing beside a clothing store entrance lowered her phone slightly. She had expected an argument. Instead, she was watching something far stranger. Elijah looked like a man waiting for a bus rather than standing at the center of public attention. The silver gift box remained tucked comfortably beneath his arm. Its ribbon moved gently in the breeze. Brandon noticed the box again. "What is in there?" Elijah glanced down. "A birthday present." "For who?" "My niece." The answer arrived instantly. Honest. Simple. Brandon studied him carefully. Nothing about Elijah's expression suggested deception. Yet something still felt off. "You came all the way to the mall for a birthday gift?" Elijah smiled faintly. "She turns 8 tomorrow." That is a pretty important age when you are 8. A few people in the crowd actually smiled at that. Brandon did not. His attention remained fixed on Elijah's watch. 3 times now the man had checked the time. 3 times he had looked strangely satisfied afterward. You keep looking at that watch, Brandon said. Expecting someone? Elijah glanced at the polished face of the watch once more. Sunlight flashed across the glass. Eventually, the answer only deepened the mystery. Near the edge of the crowd, an elderly man whispered something to his wife. A teenager continued live streaming while comments flooded his screen faster than he could read them. Every minute that passed attracted more attention. Yet Elijah remained exactly the same. Calm, patient, certain, as though he already knew how this afternoon would end. Then something unusual happened. Elijah looked beyond the rows of parked cars toward the distant road leading into the shopping complex. His faint smile returned. It was not large. Most people would have missed it. Brandon did not. What? He asked immediately. Elijah shifted the gift box slightly beneath his arm. Nothing. You saw something. Elijah looked back at him. Maybe. The answer was infuriatingly vague. Brandon turned toward the road, trying to see what Elijah had noticed. At first there was nothing. Then far beyond the outer parking lots, sunlight reflected briefly off a line of dark windshields moving steadily toward the mall. The reflection disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, but it was enough to catch Elijah Carter's attention. He kept his eyes on the distant road for a moment before returning his gaze to the crowd. Around him, the atmosphere continued to shift. What had started as curiosity was becoming speculation. People whispered. Phones remained raised. Every new person walking out of the mall seemed to slow down after noticing the gathering near the entrance. Officer Brandon Hayes followed Elijah's line of sight, but saw nothing unusual. Just traffic moving beyond the shopping center. Yet something told him the man standing in front of him knew more than he was saying. That realization bothered him. Brandon had spent years trusting his instincts. They rarely failed him. And right now, every instinct told him there was a piece missing from the puzzle. Let me ask you again, Brandon said. Who exactly are you waiting for? Elijah adjusted the silver gift box beneath his arm. The ribbon had loosened slightly during the afternoon heat. He carefully straightened it with his thumb. Someone important? Brandon pressed. Elijah smiled faintly. Everyone is important to someone. Several people nearby exchanged amused looks. Brandon did not. He was beginning to feel as though every answer only created more questions. The crowd sensed it too. A teenage girl standing beside her mother lowered her phone long enough to whisper, "He talks like he already knows what is going to happen." Her mother nodded. It certainly looked that way. Elijah's calm was becoming contagious. The more relaxed he appeared, the more uncomfortable everyone else seemed to become. Near the fountain, a mall security supervisor quietly approached another officer. They exchanged a few words before both glanced toward Elijah. Neither appeared concerned. Confused, perhaps, but not concerned. That detail did not escape Brandon. Usually situations escalated because people reacted emotionally. Elijah was doing the opposite. He remained patient, respectful, almost thoughtful. Brandon's eyes dropped toward the gift box again. You said that is for your niece. Yes. What is inside? Elijah looked down at the wrapping paper. For a moment his expression softened. A promise. The answer caught Brandon completely off guard. A promise. Elijah nodded. I told her I would never miss her birthday. The words seemed genuine. More genuine than anything else said all afternoon. For the first time, a few people in the crowd looked at Elijah differently. Not as a stranger. Not as the center of a public incident. Just as an uncle trying to keep his word. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the parking lot. Long shadows stretched between parked vehicles. Somewhere in the distance, an engine could be heard. Then another. Faint at first. Easy to miss beneath the noise of traffic. Elijah glanced at his watch again. This time he did not smile. He simply nodded once, as though confirming something to himself. Brandon noticed immediately. What was that? Elijah looked up. What was what? That look. Elijah paused. Relief. Brandon frowned. Relief about what? Elijah's eyes moved toward the road one final time. Far beyond the outer rows of vehicles, dark shapes had begun appearing one after another. Still distant. Still impossible for most people to identify. Yet they were getting closer. Much closer. Elijah took a slow breath. Then he looked directly at Brandon and said, The waiting part is almost over. Officer Brandon Hayes stared at Elijah Carter for several seconds after hearing those words. The waiting part is almost over. The sentence should have sounded ordinary. Instead, it landed with enough certainty to make Brandon uncomfortable. Around them, the crowd continued growing. People shifted positions to get a better view. Phones remained raised. Some shoppers had completely forgotten why they came to the mall in the first place. They were watching a story unfold, even if none of them understood it yet. Elijah adjusted his grip on the silver gift box and looked toward the distant road again. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the wrapping paper, creating brief flashes of light across the parking lot. Brandon followed his gaze. This time he could see them too. Dark vehicles. Several of them. Still far away, but moving steadily toward the shopping center entrance. Friends of yours? Brandon asked. Elijah looked back at him. Not exactly. Then why do you seem so interested? Elijah thought about the question for a moment. Because they are right on time. The answer only deepened the mystery. A few people standing nearby exchanged puzzled looks. The teenager live streaming the scene zoomed his camera toward the approaching road. Comments were pouring in faster than he could read them. Nobody seemed able to agree on what was happening. Some believed Elijah was about to face bigger problems. Others thought the arriving vehicles had nothing to do with him. Brandon was beginning to suspect otherwise. He folded his arms and stepped slightly closer. You keep acting like you know something nobody else knows. Elijah nodded once. That is probably true. The honesty of the response caught Brandon off guard. Usually people avoided direct answers. Elijah seemed completely comfortable giving them. Near the mall entrance, two security officers quietly spoke with each other while watching the scene. Neither appeared alarmed. That detail continued bothering Brandon. If Elijah truly represented a threat, somebody should have been concerned by now. Yet the longer this situation continued, the more it felt as though everyone except Brandon was slowly relaxing. Even the crowd had changed. The whispers sounded different. Less suspicious. More curious. Elijah glanced down at the gift box again. His thumb lightly touched one corner where the ribbon crossed. For a brief moment his expression softened. Brandon noticed. You really care about that present. Elijah smiled. More than you know. What makes it so special? Elijah looked toward the mall entrance where families walked in and out carrying shopping bags. Because I made a promise. Brandon sighed. You already said that. And I meant it. The answer carried a weight that was difficult to explain. Suddenly, the distant sound of engines became much louder. Heads turned almost in unison. The line of dark vehicles was no longer difficult to see. They had entered the outer section of the parking lot and were moving directly toward the mall. One after another. Perfectly spaced. Deliberate. Professional. The crowd fell noticeably quieter. Even the teenager stopped talking to his livestream audience. Brandon's jaw tightened. Something about the formation felt official. Very official. Elijah checked his watch one final time. Then he slipped his hand into his jacket pocket and calmly said, I was hoping they would not be late. As the first dark SUV turned into the main parking lane, every person standing there suddenly realized this afternoon was about to become something very different. The first SUV rolled past the outer parking rows with slow, deliberate precision. Then came a second, a third, a fourth. Within moments, the entire line of dark vehicles was moving through the shopping center like a single coordinated unit. Sunlight flashed across tinted windows. The low hum of engines echoed between parked cars. Every conversation in the crowd stopped. People who had been whispering seconds earlier now stood completely silent. Phones remained raised, but even those recording seemed unsure what they were witnessing. Officer Brandon Hayes watched the approaching convoy and felt a knot forming in his stomach. This was no coincidence. No delivery service arrived like this. No corporate executives traveled in formations like this. Whatever was happening, it was organized. Very organized. Beside him, Elijah Carter remained perfectly calm. The silver gift box stayed tucked beneath his arm. The ribbon moved slightly in the afternoon breeze. His expression had not changed. That detail bothered Brandon more than anything else. The crowd was nervous. Mall security looked confused. Even several officers who had arrived to assist were exchanging uncertain glances. Yet Elijah looked like a man waiting for an appointment he expected to keep. The first SUV slowed near the main entrance. Then another positioned itself nearby. One by one, the vehicles came to a stop. The parking lot became so quiet that people could hear distant music drifting from inside the mall. Elijah checked his watch again. This time he seemed satisfied. He slipped the watch beneath his jacket sleeve and took a slow breath. Brandon stepped closer. You knew they were coming. It was not a question. Elijah looked at him. I hope they were. Brandon studied his face. Who are they? Elijah glanced toward the vehicles. You will know soon enough. The answer only deepened the tension. A young man holding a shopping bag whispered, This is getting weird. Nobody disagreed. Near the fountain, several families began gathering closer together. Not because they felt threatened, but because curiosity had completely taken over. The convoy had transformed an ordinary shopping afternoon into something nobody could explain. The doors of the SUVs remained closed. Seconds passed. Then more seconds. Nobody stepped out. Nobody spoke. The silence itself became unsettling. Brandon folded his arms and tried to maintain authority, but even he could feel the atmosphere changing. The situation was slipping beyond his understanding. Elijah lowered his eyes toward the gift box for a brief moment. A soft smile touched his face. The expression was different this time. Warmer. More personal. As though he were thinking about someone far away from this parking lot. Someone waiting for him. His niece. The birthday promise. The reason he had come here in the first place. Then the first SUV door finally opened. The crowd leaned forward almost as one. Several phones zoomed in. Brandon felt his pulse quicken. Elijah simply stood there. Calm. Patient. Certain. And as the first polished shoe touched the pavement, every person watching suddenly realized that whatever happened next was going to change the entire story. The polished shoe remained motionless on the pavement for a moment before its owner stepped fully into view. Yet Elijah Carter did not look toward the person emerging from the SUV. Instead, he lifted his face toward the afternoon sky. The sunlight had softened. Thin clouds drifted slowly above the shopping center. A gentle breeze moved through the parking lot, carrying the distant sounds of families enjoying an ordinary Saturday. For a brief moment, everything felt strangely peaceful. Around him, however, nobody else seemed capable of relaxing. Every eye remained fixed on the line of dark vehicles. Every phone remained raised. Every conversation had disappeared. The entire parking lot felt suspended in time. Elijah looked down at the silver gift box in his hands. The wrapping paper had become slightly creased from carrying it around all afternoon. One corner of the ribbon had loosened. Carefully, he adjusted it. The simple act seemed almost absurd given the tension surrounding him. Yet that was exactly what mattered. The gift was the reason he had come to the mall. The promise was the reason he had stayed. Everything else had simply happened around him. Officer Brandon Hayes watched the scene with growing uncertainty. The confidence that had carried him through the afternoon was fading. He no longer felt like the person controlling the situation. The arriving convoy had changed that. The crowd sensed it too. People were no longer watching Elijah. They were watching everyone else, waiting to see who truly understood what was happening. Elijah gently brushed his thumb across the ribbon and thought about his niece. He pictured the excitement on her face when she opened the box. He remembered the phone call from 2 weeks earlier when she had asked whether he would make it to her birthday this year. He had promised her he would. The memory brought a faint smile to his face. Nearby, a little girl walking past with her parents noticed the wrapped gift and tugged on her mother's sleeve. The mother whispered something back, and both smiled briefly before turning their attention toward the strange convoy. Life continued around the edges of the moment. That realization grounded Elijah. Whatever happened next, there would still be birthdays, families, promises, ordinary people living ordinary lives. The thought brought him a sense of calm that nobody else seemed able to understand. The breeze strengthened slightly. A loose shopping receipt rolled across the pavement. Sunlight reflected from the windshields of the SUVs like flashes of gold. Brandon shifted his weight and glanced toward the nearest vehicle again. More doors were beginning to open. Figures moved inside the shadows of the tinted glass. The crowd leaned forward. Anticipation filled the air. Yet Elijah remained completely still. He looked at his watch one more time. Then he slipped both hands around the gift box and exhaled slowly. The waiting was finished. The uncertainty was finished. Whatever came next had already been set in motion long before anyone gathered outside the mall. The sounds of footsteps began echoing across the parking lot. Calm footsteps. Measured footsteps. Approaching steadily from the convoy. Elijah finally lifted his eyes toward the arriving figures, and for the first time all afternoon, the quiet smile on his face returned. The footsteps grew louder with each passing second. Calm, measured, professional. The crowd parted almost instinctively as several men and women in dark suits moved away from the convoy and toward the center of the parking lot. Their expressions were focused. Their pace never changed. Officer Brandon Hayes watched them approach and felt a brief surge of relief. For the first time all afternoon, he believed he understood what was happening. The arriving officials had seen the situation. They would take over. They would ask questions. And somehow Elijah Carter would finally lose that impossible calm expression. At least that was what Brandon expected. Around him, the crowd seemed to reach the same conclusion. A woman standing near the mall entrance whispered that things were about to get much worse for the man holding the silver gift box. Several others nodded. The line of SUVs alone was enough to convince people that something serious was unfolding. Elijah remained motionless. His hands rested lightly on the gift. His eyes followed the approaching figures without the slightest hint of concern. Then the lead woman stepped forward. She appeared to be in her 40s, dressed in a dark tailored suit, carrying a thin leather portfolio beneath one arm. Her attention moved across the scene once. She saw the crowd. She saw the officers. She saw the raised phones. Then her eyes settled on Elijah. Everything changed. A warm smile immediately crossed her face. Not the smile of someone arriving to investigate him. The smile of someone arriving to meet him. Several people noticed it at the same time. Confusion spread through the crowd. Brandon's relief vanished. Instantly, the woman walked directly toward Elijah without hesitation. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Thank you for waiting." The parking lot fell completely silent. Elijah smiled and nodded politely. "Good afternoon, Agent Collins." The name seemed to echo through the crowd. Agent Collins extended her hand. Elijah shook it. The simple gesture landed harder than any speech could have. Brandon stared in disbelief. The teenager live streaming lowered his phone for a moment, convinced he had misunderstood what he was seeing. Agent Collins turned toward the officers. Her expression remained professional. "We apologize for the delay," she said. "Traffic was heavier than expected." Then she looked back at Elijah. "The documents arrived exactly as you described." Every timeline matched. Several officers exchanged nervous glances. Brandon felt his stomach tighten. Documents. Timelines. The words carried implications he did not like. Agent Collins opened the portfolio and removed several folders. "Your assistance over the last 6 months has been invaluable." The crowd reacted immediately. 6 months. Assistance. Suddenly the story everyone believed they understood no longer made sense. Elijah was not acting like someone being rescued. He was acting like someone who had been expecting colleagues. Agent Collins continued, "Without your cooperation, several important reviews would still be incomplete." Elijah lowered his eyes briefly. "I just wanted the truth documented correctly." The answer was quiet, humble, genuine. Agent Collins nodded. "And because of that, a great many questions finally have answers." Brandon looked at Elijah as though seeing him for the first time. The calm, the watch, the certainty. None of it had been confidence born from luck. It came from knowledge. Elijah had known exactly who was coming, exactly why they were coming. And as every officer stood frozen in stunned silence, the truth finally began revealing itself. For several long seconds, nobody in the parking lot seemed capable of speaking. The afternoon noise of the mall continued somewhere in the distance, but near the line of SUVs, silence had taken over completely. Phones remained raised. Shopping bags hung forgotten at people's sides. Even the breeze seemed quieter now. Agent Rebecca Collins closed the folder in her hands and looked toward Elijah Carter with unmistakable respect. The gesture alone said more than any explanation could. A man many people had spent the afternoon judging was now being thanked by the very people everyone assumed had come for him. Officer Brandon Hayes stood motionless. The certainty he had carried all day was gone. In its place was a growing realization that he had never truly understood the situation at all. He glanced toward Elijah. The same man, the same jacket, the same silver gift box. Nothing about Elijah had changed. Only the assumptions surrounding him had. That truth was difficult to ignore. Agent Collins spoke quietly with several members of her team before returning her attention to Elijah. "You have been remarkably patient today," she said. Elijah smiled softly. Patience gets easier when you know the truth eventually catches up. A few people in the crowd lowered their phones. The excitement that had fueled the gathering was slowly being replaced by reflection. They had come expecting a public downfall. Instead, they had witnessed something entirely different. Elijah looked around the parking lot. He saw families, store employees, shoppers, ordinary people who had simply been passing through their day. None of them knew his story. None of them knew the months he had spent helping verify reports, timelines, and records. Yet he felt no resentment toward them. Most people made decisions using the information they had. The problem was not always malice. Sometimes it was assumption. Brandon finally stepped forward. His expression had changed. The tension was gone. So was the confidence. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly. Elijah turned toward him. For a moment, neither man spoke. The crowd watched closely. This felt like the real ending to the day. Not the arrival of the SUVs. Not the appearance of federal officials. This moment. Brandon looked down briefly before meeting Elijah's eyes again. "I think I misunderstood a lot of things today." The admission was simple, honest. Elijah studied him for a second before nodding. "That happens." Brandon gave a faint laugh. "You make it sound easy." Elijah glanced at the gift box in his hands. "It usually is not." Then his expression softened. "But people are allowed to learn." The words seemed to land harder than any criticism could have. Agent Collins watched quietly. She understood something important was happening. Accountability mattered. Facts mattered. But growth mattered too. The afternoon sun continued sinking lower over the shopping center. Long golden lights stretched across the pavement. Reflections shimmered beneath the parked SUVs. Elijah adjusted the ribbon on the gift box one final time and smiled. Somewhere across town, an 8-year-old girl was still waiting for her birthday present. And despite everything that had happened, he intended to keep his promise. The crowd began to disperse slowly, as if nobody wanted to be the first person to leave. Conversations returned in quiet fragments. Shopping carts rolled across the pavement. Store doors opened and closed. Life, which had seemed frozen for most of the afternoon, was finally moving again. Elijah Carter stood beside the line of dark SUVs for a few more moments, listening to the familiar sounds of an ordinary day returning to normal. The silver gift box remained secure in his hands. After everything that had happened, it was still the most important thing he carried. Agent Rebecca Collins shook his hand one last time. "Thank you again, Mr. Carter." Elijah smiled. "Take care, Agent Collins." She nodded and returned to her team. Nearby, several officials began gathering folders and preparing to leave. The purpose of their visit had been fulfilled. The truth no longer needed an introduction. It could stand on its own. Across the parking lot, Officer Brandon Hayes remained near the mall entrance. He watched quietly as the afternoon drew to a close. The expression on his face was different now. Thoughtful. Reflective. Elijah noticed him standing there and offered a small nod before turning away. No speech was necessary. No dramatic final exchange was required. Some lessons were learned best in silence. The golden light of late afternoon stretched across the rows of parked cars. Reflections shimmered on windshields. Long shadows crossed the pavement like dark ribbons. Elijah walked toward his pickup truck at an unhurried pace. The excitement, the attention, the questions, all of it seemed farther away with every step. He reached the driver's side door and paused. For a moment, he looked down at the gift box. The wrapping paper was no longer perfect. One corner was slightly bent. The ribbon was not as neat as it had been earlier that day. Yet somehow it felt more valuable now. It had traveled through uncertainty and still arrived exactly where it needed to be. Elijah carefully placed the box on the passenger seat. Sunlight poured through the windshield and illuminated the silver paper with a warm glow. He smiled. Somewhere across town, his niece was probably counting the hours until her birthday celebration. She knew nothing about SUVs, officials, crowds, or assumptions. She only knew her uncle had promised he would be there. Elijah started the engine. The familiar sound filled the quiet cab. Before pulling away, he glanced once more toward the shopping center. Families continued walking beneath the fading sunlight. Children laughed near the fountain. Store signs glowed softly as evening approached. Everything looked ordinary again. And perhaps that was the most meaningful part of all. The day had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about keeping a promise, standing by the truth, and refusing to let other people's assumptions define who he was. Elijah shifted the truck into gear and slowly drove toward the exit. Above the parking lot, the sky had turned a brilliant mix of gold and blue. The last rays of sunlight reflected across the road ahead. As the mall disappeared in his rearview mirror, the silver gift box rested quietly beside him, and for the first time all day, there was nothing left to wait for.